In no particular order, except for the very first two of these records, here are my top 10 favorite albums of all time. The Beach Boys' Smile has always been, for 30 years, has been my number one. Pet Sounds, number two. Astral Weeks, Van Morrison. Neil Young's Tonight's the Night. The Byrds, Notorious Bird Brothers. Joni Mitchell, Hajira. Blood on the Tracks by Dylan. Sly and the Family Stone, There's a Riot Going On. My Bloody Valentine, Loveless. And Slanted and Enchanted. Welcome to Discography, the music podcast that delivers the objective truth about the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever existed. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and if you're tuning in for the first time, ask yourself this. Do you think most modern discussions about music lack a certain fire and perspective? If the answer is yes, then welcome home. Please join our Facebook group, Discography Soldiers of Sound. We're on Instagram and Twitter too, but the Facebook group is home of artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians, you name it. Lots of unbelievably talented sons of bitches in there. My recommendation, if you like what you hear, is to join the group. Then while you're at it, join up on the rest of the platforms too. Then, please, rate the podcast 5 stars, along with a beautifully worded review, no matter how you feel, especially if you're on Apple, Spotify, or Podchaser. It'll help a lot. On whatever platform you do call home, you'll be privy to a never-ending flow of ongoing bonus content, giveaways, free swag, and encouraging words of wisdom on how to never, ever give up on your rock and roll dreams of maintaining a Lester Bangs-like perspective deep into adulthood. And if you're like me, and enough's just never enough, then you just stepped in shit, my friends. Visit patreon.com/discography and become one of our Patreon Soldiers of Sound. Our Patreon feed is the last word in deep dive music obsession. There are multiple tiers available at $5, $10, $20, $30, and $40 a month, through which to gain entry to the psychedelically mind-melting music funhouse of Discography's Patreon. Find the most expensive one that's right for you, so we can keep this thing owned and operated by us and for us. Because corporate magazines still suck. In this Thursday's Patreon episode, a batch of Bob bonus clips coming at you. That's Bob Nastanovich to you. All of it essential, just too off topic to keep in the main show. And it'll be available only on the Lieutenant tier and above. Okay, back to the free shit. Don't forget, the link to our legendary playlist is in the show notes, and also on our website at discography.com. This is an invaluable resource if, like me, you just hate listening to shitty songs. Lastly but not leastly, a heartfelt Discography thanks goes out to Joe Cravino, Todd Zimmer, and my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, without whose invaluable help and or morale-boosting energy, I'd be 100% dead in the water. I can't thank you enough. I care too much about this show to be easy to deal with, so also, I'm sorry. Okay, back to business. First things first, you need to know just how seriously I take this craziness. Discography is heavily researched, and the music is always reassessed with fresh ears. We're not just covering albums. We do a searingly honest deep dive analysis of all EPs, singles, comp tracks, relevant solo work, singles, and bootlegs. Every release is slapped with an objectively accurate star rating between 0 and 5, which allows us all to come face to face with the true shape of an artist's overall arc. In this episode of Discography, we'll be turning our spray cans back on Pavement. This is actually part 2 of an incredible 6-part series designed to play throughout the duration of their 2022 reunion tour. Part 2 takes place solely in the hallowed year of 1992. And if you're a Pavement fan, you know exactly what that means. Slanted and Enchanted and Watery Domestic. But let's start with Slanted, shall we? Slanted is where it all comes together.
Where did you put Torch of the Mystics by Sun City Girls? Or
it's on there. It's just not.
What about Akaraki by Senyawa?
I'm not even familiar with who that is. Who is that?
It's a band called Senyawa, Senyawa, and the album is called Akaraki, Akaraki. It was released in 2014.
Is that really good, or are you just trying to trip me up?
You can listen to it. I'm sure you have music streaming.
Yeah, but I mean, whatever method doesn't matter. But
dude, you'll like it. I don't know. Maybe you'll hate it. I don't know. I'm just saying, and I'm not putting in my top 10. I'm just saying it's something that you should listen to from the last 10 years if you want to be freaked out.
I do want to be. I constantly
seems like you're a jog on the beach kind of guy,
I'm all over it the second this is done. Is it true? Is it true that all of the songs on this objectively and inarguably classic album were made on a battered nylon string guitar lying around your apartment?
I didn't really kind of know that. I would assume that they were all made on what is sort of called the Pavement guitar, which is this very cheap. I believe it costs under $20. Stephen would have to verify that. It's a Stratocaster ripoff, which were very common at the time, generally called a Mexican Stratocaster, that were sort of Fender knockoffs that were being made very cheaply in Mexico. I don't know what they originally sold for, but Stephen bought his somewhere for, I believe, $15. And that guitar has been lying around everywhere where Stephen has been, including, I think, every live show he's ever played, even to today. I mean, it's amazing that guitar has survived in the possession of somebody who's quite careless with their possessions.
Has he always been that way?
I think up until the time he became a dad.
I think there was like 2 or 3 sessions to record Slanted. So it was about a week to get the first batch of tunes down, and those were the rockers. The more mellow tunes like Here and In the Mouth of Desert were done a couple weeks later, which is after Christmas 1991. And Gary's production is pretty much Gary's in the garage behind the drum set, or he goes over to the tape machine, which is in the laundry room of his house. He runs into the garage where the guys were, play, and then run back out and stop the tape machine, right?
Yeah, I observed that during the recording of Watery Domestic, that same process. And I think one significant thing you need to know about Slanted Enchanted was Gary's board or studio was actually meant to be a 16-track recording studio, which was very common and affordable at the time. Mm-hmm. And he'd had it for many years, and one of the tracks was broken. So this is actually recorded on a viable 15-track recording machine. And that was obviously more than enough tracks. I mean,
yeah,
obviously Gary, not only with his recording, but his drumming was extremely vital to this album, and made a lot of the songs.
So, yeah, I'm curious about your stance on that, because, your take on it when Gary left is there even a reason for me to be in this band now, right?
Well, yeah, sure, because the only reason I was in the band in the first place was because it's an insurance policy for Gary's alcoholism. So everyone I know, and by the way, this is no reflection on Steve West. It's just they're different styles of drumming. But, it's a very interesting problem in the band, because you have this guy obviously is not fitting. He obviously doesn't belong in there. And yet I can say with total certainty that it's, as far as rock and roll drumming goes, it's up there with the greats. I mean, I would put it up there with Keith Moon. Well, I mean, that's really, and then I'm sure a lot of Gary's heroes, which I'm incapable of naming, because he's 15 years older than me, and we didn't really listen to any of the same music, or I didn't listen to any of the music that sort of changed his life when he was a teenager or in his 20s. Gary had been in bands for over 25 years at this point, and he was kind of addicted to drumming and recording music. So, and he's, very gifted and very talented. Of course, it was difficult to be in a band with him, as not only his tour manager, but somebody who became kind of like his attendant and best friend in the band. I mean, I was his first man at his wedding. I sort of felt the need on several occasions to check his pulse, which was quite stressful for somebody, doing something they'd never done before, quite a wild adventure. And you're worried about, one of your bandmates dying on a frequent basis.
I remember the night that I saw you guys at the Avalon, he unleashed a bunch of lobsters into the crowd.
Yeah, that kind of behavior. I mean, that was pretty extreme, and I thought that it was politically incorrect as a animal lover. But you're not going to stop him. I mean, like, I could sit back there and explain with Eyebold how he thought it was a really bad idea, but that would only spur him on and make him more likely to do it.
Right.
I mean, it would have been hypocritical on my part because I eat shellfish.
Yeah.
I still think it's kind of a disgraceful way for a live lobster to go. But as far as I know, I think there's 3 or 4 of them.
I know in the lobster community, they consider it an honor to have been massacred during that show. It's kind of known as the lobster Altamont.
I mean, obviously, they were going to the hands of, in many cases, experienced lobster folk in the Boston audience. So,
right, exactly.
I would not have known what happened to any of those lobsters, obviously. I mean, he did a lot of absurd things, and that was sort of top 10 for me.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you saw that. But he was, that was sort of Gary's significance to the band. Not only was he completely essential artistically as a drummer and as a studio guy and willing, but, his parents sort of looked after the band. We'd practice in his parents' house quite often. He was raised in Mamaroneck, New York, and eventually moved to Stockton well before Pavement started. But
when I think about those tiny moments, like at the end of every line of Summer Babe, the ticket on the hi-hat, the triples. And then
that's amazing. He was just amazing. So when he was on, I had the easiest job in the history of rock and roll, but that
right.
was sort of unpredictable.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember as his tour manager, back then when you'd go into clubs, the schedule, if there's 2, 3, 4 bands playing, would be, there'd be like set times with 10 to 15 minutes between bands. But you and I know the way it really works. So if the headlining band was meant to go on 11:30, that usually meant they were going on at 12:30 because of this delay, that delay. So I'd have to explain to these promoter people at these clubs when I turned up that, like it says here, that Pavement's supposed to play at 11:30. I mean, do you want me to tell you the difference between my drummer at 11:30 or 1? And so, you had to roll with the punches, but at least I had the opportunity to say, I need to get this guy on stage as close to time as possible because, the band that people were paying $6 or $8 to go see, they'd much rather see an incredibly interesting performer and drummer play than hear some guy who at the time only really knew how to keep time in sort of a 4/4 beat. At this point, I probably had played, a few dozen live shows, and everything for me on Slanted Enchanted was a baptism by fire. I mean, it was kind of scary to play at Reading Festival in front of 10 or 20,000 people on the same day that Nirvana played at their legendary Reading Festival show in '92. I think we played for like 35 minutes, and I mean, it was pretty terrifying for me. I mean, same with the opening for My Buddy Valentine thing. I mean, you personally saw the chaos that would ensue at the Avalon show, but that was Pavement on their own terms. So it was difficult when we sort of.
You guys are amazing. You guys sounded so good. Whatever kind of craziness was happening behind the scenes with Gary, or the insanity that you guys may have felt at the time. Maybe not insanity, but the pressure of expectation. It didn't come across. It just felt like you guys were riding high, having a blast. I remember smiles all around.
Well, one great thing about Boston is usually you would go there and play there the night after you played New York, which would be a very, very tense, high pressure thing for just about everybody in the band. Possible exception would be Scott. Bigger deal for Gary because all of his friends would come down from Westchester County as well. So we'd usually get to Boston completely running on fumes, and when you're that exhausted at least at that age, then your nerves are shot. And so we were completely dependent on the Boston audience, who is very knowledgeable and cared a lot about Pavement, to kind of carry us on our backs. And so your nerves are shot, but the crowd's providing you with like kind of a lifeline of energy. So for some reason, at 4 or 5 o'clock, when you're like, I can't believe that we have to get on a stage tonight and play. When we actually would take the stage in Boston, whether it be at Middle East or Avalon or wherever we would play, there was the audience made it easy in a great way.
Yeah. I remember I saw Flaming Lips at TT the Bears in December 1991. That was a great show, back when Ronald Jones was still in the band. Let's talk about this record. There's so much to talk about with regard to the songs on this. First of all, the title, one of the greatest album titles of all time, objectively, is taken from the title of a cartoon that was made by David Berman, right?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, we'd all gotten to be quite good friends. And I mean, I was friends with him kind of from the start, but Silver Jews existed, and amongst David's many skills, he was a brilliant cartoonist, and I don't think he intentionally made the cartoon for any reason other than his own enjoyment. And I actually wasn't part of the conversation when Steven, may or may not, probably did ask him permission to use his cartoon title that I think that was stuck on our wall of our apartment as the album title. But that's how it all worked out. It's definitely very Berman-esque.
The first 3 titles of your LPs are, I remember reading somewhere, I don't know if it was this particular journalist's take on things, but to go from Slanted and Enchanted, Crooked Rain, Wowie Zowie, they're all kind of rhymey, but with intentionally diminishing return shades of excitement. Was there ever a long-term plan on titling the records in a rhyming kind of way?
No, I think that, basically just like every band tries to give their albums what they think are cool titles. And sometimes you hit and sometimes you miss. I mean, personally, the most difficult one to title would have been Terror Twilight. But in the end, I think that's a good album title.
Yeah, it is.
And when you have a pretty limited body of work like we did, there weren't too many things to name.
So, all right, we're kicking off with Summer Babe Winter Version, one of the great debut openers of all time. I mean, I love thinking about, one of the greatest, everyone in the Discography Soldiers of Sound Facebook group, always talking about what are the greatest debut records of all time. But then, a great album opener on your debut record, that's certainly important. You don't get much better than this. And oddly, Steven wanted it dropped from the track list and Spiral saved it, apparently.
Well, it had already been released. Yeah, I imagine that would have been the logic behind Steven's thinking there. Like, that was probably sort of kind of more of a business decision on Scott's part, because we're going from Drag City, an intentionally small indie rock label, to something that's a far bigger deal in Matador. And, sort of the decision had been made and agreed upon by Pavement and Drag City that we were going to sort of, for lack of a better verb, shop this record around. And, it was kind of floating around the music industry, and fanzines and people who cared, at least in that world, were kind of awaiting its release with bated breath. I mean, the first time I ever heard these songs as a collection in Hoboken with a couple of friends of mine that were in a band called Francis Scum. Their names were Eric Forst and Steve Healy. At that time, we were like, okay, Pavement's like a really cool thing to be a part of, and Pavement is kind of a fun way to go through living in New York City. With 2 separate identities, as a bus driver and as like a dude that goes and sees bands. But after this, we heard this collection of songs. It was like, okay, now Pavement's actually now going to be something more real. and start touring and somewhat unbelievably playing shows in different countries. And that reality sort of kind of made sense when I heard this collection of songs for the first time, probably about in the spring or summer of 91, like 4 to 6 months after it was finished.
I remember hearing it for the first time. I remember just having like long conversations with my friends about it.
Same. I mean, it was pretty intense to be in the band. I'm
sure. I can only fucking imagine. It was life-changing to hear this stuff because at that time, I was engaged in nothing but creative pursuits. I mean, I went to film school. I was at the time writing a feature film called Jesus 2. I had a life of creativity ahead of me that I'm still engaged in. And this was endlessly inspiring to me and made it seem like people that were just like me were, their dreams were coming to fruition. So it could happen.
That's cool.
Even with the, the reticence and the slack and stuff like that, even that stuff was creeping in because I was boundlessly ambitious, but felt that sort of interior tugging on my shirt sleeve that there's got to be more to life than just, striving after that thing, attaining that thing, and then wondering what next.
Yeah. I mean, I was a New York City bus driver, which was for most mothers, I'll just say that, of people that graduated from the University of Virginia with an American government degree that had never really made anything of. I appreciate her concern in having her son move to a city that was still quite dangerous at the time, and then telling her that I was in a band that was going to go on tour for the bulk of 1992, and having my mother say, "What do you mean you're?" She's like, "You play in the band?" And I'm very close to my mother. And
your dad too, or just your mom?
Yeah, my father, who passed away in 2011. Was one of my favorite people of all time, and they were married for over 50 years, and incredibly great parents. And I also have a wonderful sister who's a couple years older. My father, who saw more Pavement performances probably than any other Pavement parent, was just so thrilled by it all. My mother was a tougher sell.
Really?
Yeah, my father was like blown away. Like he would have loved to have been in that position. Was your mom a tougher sell on the music, or you? No. She actually never really listened to Pavement. She saw many Pavement live shows. Kind of the Eurythmics were more her vibe.
Yeah.
Several years after the fact, she would have been like, power walking or something, and kind of giving Pavement a real listen on her headphones for the first time, and realizing, and she's a Bob Dylan fan, realizing sort of the excellence of the music in her set of criteria and opinion making about music that she hadn't recognized when she was probably just apprehensive about these group of boys that had stayed in her house many times that she'd done the laundry for and all these things. I mean, she in a great way, she's a warrior. So yeah, she was concerned. I mean, she loved Gary. I mean, we spoke about him last night, as a matter of fact. Gary was more comfortable with her age group than mine, because he knew a lot more people, and he's right in between my mother's age and my age, and he would gravitate and adore his time with all of the Pavement parents, all of them. He was accepted differently by all of them as well. But I think that the Ibolds and the Nastanoviches really enjoyed him the most and appreciated him the most. And a lot of those shows during that era were, packed to the gills. So I remember seeing like my mother afterwards. I don't know if I'd ever seen her as soaked in sweat.
She was probably in the pit the whole time.
My father, now he would have been in the pit many times. He was in the pit at the Khyber Pass pub in Philadelphia the first time we ever played there.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I think that might have been his Pavement debut. He might have been at the first Pavement gig in 1990 at Court Tavern in Brunswick.
I like to think of him stage diving.
Yeah, no, he would pop up everywhere. I mean, he has his favorite Pavement songs of all time. Like his favorite one was Fillmore Jive.
Interesting. That's a really interesting choice.
He needed to sleep.
Yeah, yeah. He had insomnia, so that one worked for him.
Just worked hard.
All right, so Summer Babe, Trigger Cut, Wounded Kite at 17 could be my favorite on the record. I love those.
Great Pavement song. I mean, obviously we play it just about every night. It's very unique and very sort of defining of this new style of Pavement where we're not hiding anymore. I think that's the most significant thing about Slanted Enchanted is that, we're removing some of the shroud here. We're turning up the vocals. We're presenting ourselves differently. We're presenting ourselves more as a real entity. We had a 5-piece live band now. Mark had, was a very full-fledged part of the band. Although keep in mind this particular recording was the 3 of them, but it was made with the band concept as a serious possibility.
Okay, so it's not necessarily recorded with the idea that this is how it's going to be, but that hopefully it will be presented in that way. So in other words, when this was being recorded, was the idea that, because at this point it's still Pavement as a concept, not quite a band.
We played 7 or 8 live shows. So I don't really know what the intent was, but I think that the tour, even though we probably played in total for a few hundred people, might have changed the perspective on, this might be played live. That might have been part of the thinking. But I think more significantly, it was time to, come out of their shell. I'll speak for the 3 of them. It just needed to be bolder. The world didn't need more of the Westing by Musket and Sexton era, which
right. I feel like you guys did just enough of that. I mean, it was like right spot on, like the exact right amount before you created your first, real major work,
And there's a lot of zeitgeist involved with all of this. One of the reasons why Pavement was very successful was the timing of everything and sort of what was going on in their cultural background in music. So, good fortune is a massive part of.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of stuff that, as one of the things about rock and pop music is so much music that was absolutely brilliant wasn't appreciated till well after the fact. But Pavement had the good fortune of not having to fall into that category, and that was sort of by accident. It wasn't by intent. It was just part of our good fortune.
Yeah, you guys always seem to ride the fine line between like a well-kept secret and very successful.
That's just coincidental.
Right.
I mean, Slanted Enchanted is very much, I don't know what the exact dates of their Nirvana explosion are, but it was pretty much concurrent to this, but it was out beforehand. So we didn't have to worry about any of that crap that changed the music industry. I mean, I'm not saying the music was crap. I'm saying the effect, the business effect.
Yeah. It's also it's hard to separate it out because when I think back to that time, everybody I knew didn't just have Slanted and Enchanted, but were listening to it all the time. So to come to the realization years later that it was successful, but it was not like a diamond level success. It just doesn't jibe with my experience. In my world, it was that successful.
It was listenable.
Yeah, well, wherever I went, it was playing.
Yeah, and one thing you have to keep in mind about this album, there is a discardable song on it. It would be Jackal's False Grails at the Lonesome Era. That's never been played live. It was sort of a departure from everything else on the record.
It seems like sort of an outro.
Yeah, I'm just happy not to hear it. There isn't any completely perfect Pavement record, obviously.
No, this is perfect. I'm sorry, man.
Not to me. Despite the fact Chesley's Little Wrist was named after my late girlfriend Chesley, who Stephen was friends with, and so that has personal meaning to me. I mean, I think that probably musically that is not an essential to any Pavement fan, unless they just lump it in with all the really noisy, weird things that could have been on any of the early records. And then Jackal's False Grails, the Lonesome Era, was a song that just doesn't sound like a Pavement song to me.
Yeah, it's it feels more like a Demolition Plot sort of interstitial thing.
I don't know really even what it feels like. It didn't fit.
Let's talk about that that chord toward the beginning of In the Mouth of Desert. You know the chord I'm talking about? If one chord on a guitar could sum up the entire aesthetic concept of what Pavement does, it's this one chord. That one.
Yeah. It's great.
Really summarizes seemingly
nothing to do with it. Thank you.
It's okay just to be around it. Thank you.
No problem.
Look,
very fun to play live.
No Life Singed Her, Conduit for Sale, Zurich is Stained.
Very fall influence, very directly fall influence, Conduit for Sale.
Definitely one of my favorite songs on the record. I'm really just naming them because they're just, to me, they're perfect. I mean, I almost don't know what to say because these songs are such a part of my DNA.
It's one of your favorite albums of all time. I don't think that with your music listening experience, I can see how that makes sense that you would love this album.
But I want to talk about moments that pop up. Okay, so
sure.
Let's talk about the very end of Fame Thrower. You know, like moments like that would probably cease to be a thing that Steve would utilize in a songwriting way. I think as he became more, maybe less intrigued by experimentalism and more by the craft of songwriting. But these moments that are, you know, thrown through the record are so amazing and always feel endlessly surprising.
I think he's conscious of dynamic. Both with live performances and albums. And, you know, every song on this album is under 4 minutes. I think the average would sort of be in the neighborhood of 240. So, I think tempo-wise, things are all over the place. There's a consciousness of avoiding sameness. I mean, you know, you got to consider that Loretta Scar's ended up being a song called LS2. Yeah. That was a different song, but it reminded him very much so.
LS2 is my favorite on Crooked Rain.
After he wrote it and then recorded it, he realized that it was very reminiscent of Loretta Scar's one.
Most of these songs, they feel like anthems to me. I mean, not like they're intentionally created that way.
No. I mean, there's some great Pavement songs on here. I mean, that's all, you know.
No, this is a major work, man. Here's my notes for it. One of my 5 favorite rock and roll albums of all time. Interview-averse, Dylan-esque in their predilection for secrecy and obfuscation. It's just about perfect. It creates a new space utilizing the great rock and roll sausage grinder. You take enough influences and grind them together, and inevitably you come up with something new. But then, of course, the challenge becomes to not repeat yourself because there's no way the work won't suffer as a result. And thus, the curse of possibly having released the greatest debut album of all time is set in motion for your band, Bob. A very hard 5 stars. And is it Perfume 5 or is it Perfume
V?
Perfume V. Okay. This is a 30-year question hanging in the balance. I appreciate it.
I think it's Perfume Veins.
Perfume Veins?
Yeah, just shortened to V.
I love it.
V isn't seen victory.
What do you give this? I'm sorry. I figured it would be a 5.
I mean, the only fault with the record is that the sound aesthetic, in terms of listening to it over the last 10 years, the way it just ends up sounding in the long run is very early 90s, which is fine because that's exactly what the record was. Mm-hmm. So I give it 5, but I understand how kids today, when they heard it, wouldn't be able to relate to it in terms of sound aesthetic. So but you can't control that when you're making a record.
But do you feel like A, you would benefit from a sonic redux, or that B, separate question, that kids today would, notwithstanding how it's produced, would connect with the message?
No, I just think it's very 91, 92 sounding in the end, which is what it was always intended to. So it's just kind of pure zeitgeist for me, spirit of the times, you know. It's no fault of the album. I'm speaking for people half my age experiencing, or younger, or even experiencing this record now as teenagers. They would be like, you know, the same way is if you listen to a band from 1978 that you loved when you were 15 and then listen to it now, and it sounded dated.
Well, you know what they did with the newest reissue of All Things Must Pass, the George Harrison record? They completely changed the character of the production to go from that Spectre-esque, epic, misty mountaintop thing to reducing it so it actually sounds like an intimate thing, like he's singing to you. And I think they ruin it.
It sounds like something that people would do when they have too much money to spend.
Yes, exactly. So 5 stars with a caveat is what you would rate it.
Yeah, I mean 5 stars, and for the purposes of this program.
1992, Slanted Offcuts. So this is basically, what I'm referring to here is My First Mine, the alternate mix of Here, Nothing Ever Happens, in My Radio. Not really to rate them necessarily, but just to mention them. The one that I really think is the most pertinent, the alternate mix of Here is terrific. The guitars sound like fucking thunderclaps.
Well, I mean, we would actually play both versions of the song live, the soft and the hard. I think it was either denoted by Q or H on the set lists. And, there's sometimes when you could use Here, the version that you're referring to now, to rock. And then there was other reasons to use it to have it match the dynamic of Here that's actually on Slanted Enchanted. But as a collection of songs, the original songs that you mentioned that have nothing to do with the album, I think that they're all very cool, and they would have made it kind of a cool little EP in their own right. But they were the reason why they were on the cutting room floor is because the album is under 40 minutes long. One edition of the album, I think it's Japanese. The B-sides, Sumi Jack and So Stark You're a Skyscraper. And Sumi Jack is one of Eyebolt's favorites. So, those could have gone on there, I think, before several of the other songs that you mentioned, but totally. This could have been a double album, but that would have been quite vain and really sort of rolling the dice. So I think the fact that in the end the album was kept under 40 minutes and the songs that are on it were chosen, if anything ended up being readily discardable, to me it would be Jackal's False Gods.
Jackal's, yeah, you don't like that, huh?
Never did.
There's
a lot of Pavement songs that I never liked.
That's interesting. Mainly because I really don't even consider it a song as such. It's more of
it just doesn't sound like anything. So I just, I think the only reason it's on there was, I don't even know. I don't know, but I think, it's just, back in the CD era.
Yeah.
When you could just easily click a button to skip a song.
Mm-hmm.
That song would be in that category on this record.
Well, dynamically, it kind of clears the path for our singer to hit you in even more an intense way.
But without it, our singer would still sound cool. I think we basically spent enough time talking about this awful song.
Agreed. All right, so let's talk about that Trigger Cut single. This is actually recorded during the Watery Domestic sessions, and it's Sumi Jack and So Stark You're a Skyscraper, both of which are classic Pavement songs. It's interesting to me that you say that Sumi Jack is a favorite of Mark Eyebold. I would have for sure thought that his pick would have been So Stark, because that deep rippling bass that curls your insides every time you hear it, that really is the guiding force of that song.
I think of that part, which I'm sure he loves as a fan, probably made him a little anxious about the idea of playing it live.
Right.
Because it might have been difficult for him to learn, but I'm just speaking out of turn. I'm speaking for him again. It's just a 5. It's an essential early Pavement 7-inch. And it's just great.
Stephen, I've read a lot of stuff recently about him in my research for this, him calling all this material that never made it to the canonical releases being referred to as shadow album. Like a shadow.
Yeah, no, I've never heard that term. That would have been purely in his line of thinking as a songwriter.
Right. Well, this I give 5 stars. Sumi Jack and So Stark, as good as anything on the album itself.
It's easy 5.
Yeah, easy 5. Recorded in April 1992, Watery Domestic, which I gotta say is one of the all-time great EPs in history. This is the recording debut of you, is that correct? And Mark Eyebold.
Oh, yes, but, we were just there, and, we were in the band, and we toured with the band the whole year, so we were it's the first time either of us ever went to Stockton. So we were just excited to be there. And Steven, I think, without putting too much thought into it, just decided to stick us on a couple of songs. That's
so what are you playing on this?
I actually play the rain stick on Greenlander, which is an outtake from this. And
love that song, man.
And then I did on Texas Never Whispers. I am reading a poem that I wrote about, or a little piece of writing that I wrote about the first 24 hours that I had spent in Stockton, about my experience that first day in Stockton. And then I just kind of read it onto one of the vocal tracks, and it was mixed in very quietly. You can hear it very easily.
That's interesting. I've never noticed it. I'm going to go back and try to listen for that now.
Yeah, I mean, but there, it was just kind of like a tip of the cap or an introduction to. I mean, they could have mixed me higher, but they could have done that many times. And I think that I was very judiciously treated. And if anything, as I got into being more of a part of the recording process, that I was never given the shaft. In fact, I've always found it remarkable how much I'm used.
You also seem to be very well loved.
Yeah.
That's got to feel good.
Hard worker.
No, but seriously, every quote about you, there's no what a prick. It's all in very glowing terms.
No, I'm not. I mean, I refuse to be that. There's already 90, God knows how many pricks there are in the history of rock and roll. But even during this genre, there's a lot of pricks. So that will keep you from wanting to be anything like them.
It's true. It doesn't stop a lot of people, though.
What does that do? You've got a lot of the people that really love the band are completely essential to your experience. And the fact that you're able to do it, they're providing you with this sort of incredible way to go through your 20s and early 30s and go to parts of the world that would have taken a lifetime to go to, even if it's for a glimpse. And you'd have to be a really insensitive person to not have strong feelings of affection and thanks towards hardcore Pavement fans. They were absolutely lovely, and they still are. Very patient. I mean, I think that we would be one of those bands that for many years that were very inconsistent live. And as many people that saw a show that you really enjoyed, like the Avalon show, would have seen complete disasters. And I think I always sort of got the sense that the audience, regardless of their expectations of the start of the show, they were sort of in a unique position of rooting for the band. I don't remember seeing that many bands where I'd be rooting for the band. I saw a lot of bands suck and disappoint, including some bands that I really love. I mean, that I'd actually
you guys are like a warts and all. Like, for example, if you're a Bob Dylan fan, I don't know how familiar you are with his work.
I just know 10 songs.
So he has made purposely bad records to try to shake off some of his more invasive fan base. And if you love Bob Dylan...
Pavement never had to worry about that. I mean, he probably was just like a lot of famous people, and his audience was too big for his comfort zone. Mm-hmm. Pavement never really had to deal with that. I mean, Pavement... Right. Our audience was kind of very easy to take in stride and very welcome. I mean, there's always this impression in certain aspects of people reacting to Pavement that we were failing in the post Nevermind era, as being referred to in this group of many bands as next Nirvana type bands. But in reality, when you get into the band itself, we were always very comfortable with the growth of our audience. Mm-hmm. There weren't really any fails to us. There might have been fails to a lot of people that were looking to cash in their chips around us, but that was not felt by the band. It was always kind of a pretty normal, natural progression.
All us Pavement fans love you in the sort of way that you would love family. It's like you can get dinner wrong. Hey, no worries.
Happy to have the love.
Yeah, please. Feels good to give it. So
thank you.
We got Mark and yourself coming on board with Watery. We have
sort of, but just a little bit, just the tip of the cap.
But Gary's out. This is the last Gary project.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think he thought that he was going to be out. I think that, one great thing about Pavement's career is that in order for the band to continue to exist, Gary, who had done so much for the band, is so vital to the first several years of the band in every way, shape, and form, that it was time for him to go. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about the way he went is he never would have been fired, because he tested those waters so many times.
Right.
And if it was a marriage, then Pavement, especially Scott and Steve, had many times to file for divorce against Gary. But at the end of the day, when the smoke cleared, Gary, who was a bit overcome by paranoia and thought that he should be making more money than he was getting, and thought that that health insurance should be provided for him, which God knows how much that would have cost. In the end, he quit. So that was a great gift to Pavement, who then had to reinvent themselves at a time that if we carried on with him in his mental and physical state, it would have been impossible for us to go on and continue to be everything we had been up until and through Watery Domestic, and touring in 92, and then actually getting back together in 93 and touring Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and then flying halfway across the world to Northern Europe, and then doing a couple of festivals in Scandinavia. And then he quit after that.
Was it a big blow up, or was it amicable at the time?
No, it was not amicable. It was basically him expressing his paranoia and then him making all these demands. It was also during a conversation in which Mark and myself wanted to have the way we were paid sort of defined in a different way. That played second fiddle to Gary's histrionics and eventually quitting the band. And then the next day, that happened all like late evening. The next day, he realized he'd made a mistake, and at the airport flying home, tried to beg his way back in to Scott and Steven, but he'd already burned his bridge. He'd already had fired himself for them, something that they probably lacked the tenacity or maybe knew how to do, because they appreciated Gary so much. But as soon as he quit, very much just sort of in the typical fashion of a young romance, and one person breaks up and then changes their mind the next day and tries to restart their relationship, it just doesn't work, does it? So this would be sort of kind of a simile to a situation like that.
And does everybody in the band feel as you do, generously and with objective remove, as far as how special his drumming was for the time, even though he was not the right fit?
I mean, if they don't, they're wrong.
Right. They are. You're right. It was, even though he wasn't the right guy, he was the right guy. So the image of the rooster on the cover of Watery Domestic was created by defacing ambergris, if that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah. Yep. Some record that you generally see for under $10 in record stores with too many pieces of vinyl in them.
And that's another great thing, is that the Watery Domestic EP cover is as good as the music inside. Stephen was really good at and really had fun sort of in kind of a pretty rapid fire way of aesthetic. He's somebody that appreciates art and in particular album art, and sees sort of the magic in it. And then what he got was, I think one of the more enjoyable aspects of him being in a band was being able to design things like the Slanted cover and the Watery Domestic cover, which were both made in the same ethic as sort of defacing previously released records. That's like the same kind of idea as discography. It's like there's no sacred cows in music history. You just kind of tag everything.
Yeah.
This, I feel like the level of songwriting here, it's like the debut, but I feel like the sophistication in the songwriting is very noticeable right away. I mean, the melodic inventiveness of Texas Never Whispers, immediately apparent.
We played live. We're a band that had garnered some confidence and another dose of Pavement. And it's some people's, like you mentioned, some people's favorite EP and 4 of their favorite Pavement songs. And
Yeah, I mean, there's not a single song on this that is not a classic. It's a big.
I know a lot of hardcore Pavement fans, obviously, and this is as essential as just about anything else. So that's, I mean, it's a 5. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
It's a hard 5. It's a big step up, yet it's an absolute continuation of the thread that was already kind of introduced with Slanted. And you could definitely make a case that this is the best all-around Pavement release.
It's just a great Pavement record.
To me, this is as good as music gets. It doesn't get better than this. It only remains as good as this. And the fade.
Yeah, but I mean, I often say this to people, like, you know, your ears are your own ears. You know, you could also say the same thing about In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins right now, and that wouldn't have anything to do with the quality of your music taste.
I love Phil Collins, man, and not ironically or at a distance. There's certain songs on Invisible Touch that I can explain to you in great detail why I think they're really good.
Gary loved them. That was part of a very formidable part of his musical experience. He loved Peter Gabriel in particular.
We did a great episode with Kevin Whelan from the Wrens on Peter Gabriel. That's his favorite. What Malcolm said was, Slanted and Enchanted was made with specific amps, and I couldn't get back to that. I didn't want to do that again. I couldn't do it anyway because it was based around Gary's studio and the stuff that he had in the first place. And Watery Domestic was the last thing we did there. I want to talk about a few outlier kinds of things that are going to get us into 1993. The first is the June 23rd, 1992 Peel session, which featured legitimately good new songs. It was not just some live throwaway non-event. Circa 1762. I want to mention I was in a 3-piece band and there were no strings, only wind and skin, torn flags. Light the burnt match and stick a flag on it. Was that improvised or was that song finished?
I think it was improvised. Name the 4 songs on this recording.
Circa 1762, Kentucky Cocktail, Secret Knowledge of Backroads, and Here.
Yeah, this is a session that happened at one of the BBC studios where the John Peel sessions are made. It would have been like done like early afternoon. Gary and I were rooming together, and Gary refused to do it. It was sort of the first inkling that he gave that he was going to quit. So it's just me playing the drums. So I think whatever the game plan would have been the night before had to be somewhat revised because Gary wasn't going to play it. You know, so yeah, that's why Secret Knowledge of Backroads, which is sort of, you know, a song that's both a Pavement song and a Silver Jews song, had to be used because obviously I can play drums on that, and it's a great song. And
what a great song. It's so
yeah, it's just a Berman Malcolmus classic sort of thing. And then the other ones were kind of thrown together. I mean, there's some of the words I'm quite aware refer in a codified manner to actual things. And then sort of the whole process was kind of very strange. So just, you know, the sound aesthetic was something that we had never chosen. I mean, this studio had to have cost gazillions of dollars. And so we'd never recorded in any situation like that. So there's sort of an insurance policy on at least it not sounding awful. It was always going to sound a different way because we never made anything in a studio like that.
And you had a few, you guys had a bunch of sessions in here. To me, this is the best one you ever had.
John Peel was a big Pavement fan and kind of, you know, like a lot of things introduced us to England. And I mean, I don't recall ever spending any time speaking with him, but I know that he loved the band, and I remember playing his 75th birthday party for a crowd of a few hundred invitees in the same areas as to where all those sessions are recorded.
You know, when I listen to this, I think of an interview I read with Noel Gallagher at one point. Not that Oasis are my favorite band or by any stretch of the imagination, but they do have some great stuff. And what he was addressing in this interview was the embarrassment of riches that he had available to him at the time as far as his creativity went. He was coming up with so many great songs that, you know, he would just fling them out on B-sides. And then years later, when he was struggling to be able to, you know, squeeze out just one good song, he would think back to that and think, man, did I take that for granted?
That's something I can't relate to at all.
What do you mean?
I mean, I just don't know what it's like to be a brilliant songwriter. I mean, I don't know. And I don't even really know if he is. I think that a lot of, I would assume that a lot of artists, regardless of what their music or visual art or whatever, have these incredible flurries of activities where things just make sense and they sort of get things right. And I think that would sort of denote, the greatest period in the artwork of many, many people, whether they be actors, dancers, musicians, anything. So I think, basically anybody could say anything like that was capable of being a creative person.
Well, I mean, luckily, this is, 30 years ago. Luckily, Stephen's spark and efficacy with regard to his songwriting has not dimmed at all. I mean, it's still great. And so is...
he might tell you otherwise, but
Maybe so. I'm a fan that's kept up the whole time. I could have, slogged off at any point. I've heard everything that Scott's put out, and I think it's all great as well. But anyway, this session I give a hard 5 to, the June 23, 1992 Peel session.
For me, it's a 3, but I was there, and it was difficult for me to be the only drummer at what was a date that we looked forward to. So just the emotion of actually having to play on it and then having my bandmates sort of have to rely on me was unique, but it was also quite nerve-wracking. And then the fact that it doesn't really sound like Pavement, aside from the fact that it is, I think that the songs themselves are fine, and I'm happy that you like them, but just the experience of being there for a handful of hours was not a pleasant memory.
Which version of Back Roads do you prefer?
They're both great. I mean, it's a great song. That's too tough of a question. I mean, it just depends on, I think it depends on what mood you're in. I think it's definitely, to me, sounds more like a Silver Jews song than a Pavement song. But keep in mind, Stephen was a very important part of, obviously entirely essential to Pavement, but also very, very important part of Silver Jews when he was in the band. So Silver Jews would not have been Silver Jews, regardless of what David, who obviously can't opine anymore, would say about it. I mean, Stephen was the only one that got invited back to make American Water, which to me is the best Silver Jews record, but we're not talking about that. Yeah.
Because the next thing that you end up doing, I have everything broken up, not by release date, but by recording session. So Peel session is June 23rd. The next month, the Arizona record. So that's with you and Steve, right?
Yeah.
So that's obviously the other version of Back Roads. I'm, unsurprisingly, a really big fan of all David's stuff as well. I do want to talk, when we get to it, talk about Starlight Walker a little bit, because it's so, at that point, blended in with what Pavement were doing. It's tougher to separate it. The next thing I want to talk about is Brixton Academy. Just real quick, just around that time, that's a great show. That was December 14th, 92. You guys sound incredible. You sound enthralled by your success and fully engaged with the material. 2 songs that I want to just toss out there. I don't think they were recorded at this event, but they're not on any official release that I've seen, and I think they're great songs. Teenage Piss Party and Black Walls.
Yeah, we just finished a lengthy tour, mostly opening for Sonic Youth. That would have been the last show of the tour. So I think, there's a certain amount of relief involved. It was a big place. It was just exciting to get it all over with. Black Walls was a song that was played many times by Pavement and was just a cool song to throw on set lists. One that...
I love that tune, man.
Yeah, one of the songs that hardcore Pavement fans were less familiar with. There was quite a few songs like that were sort of made in between records on live tours.
That one particularly, I felt like I would have loved a studio version of that.
It's cool.
Yeah. So the next thing is 2 days later, there was a second Peel session, December 16th, 92. We have Rain Ammunition, Drunks with Guns, Ed Ames, and The List of Dorms. This, to me, is not quite as good as the first one. It feels just a touch more like a stopgap release. But
probably only because Secret Knowledge of Back Roads isn't on it. I mean, I give it a 3 also. It was the same thing.
4, actually.
Gary wasn't on it.
Right. And my favorite is Drunks with Guns. I think that's the best one.
Junction Guns were a band from St. Louis that we all loved, and we were just essentially threw something together to fill the space. I mean, that was completely made up on the spot.
Well, it's a great song. It's a great song regardless of that, but especially knowing that.
It's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I give it 4 stars, so I like it a little bit more than you. Then one that you mentioned, and it's funny, Greenlander, recorded during the Watery Domestic sessions. It was put on, don't remember the compilation. Was it a DGC thing?
Can't remember exactly what it was. It ended up on something. It ended up in one of those situations where some compilation that we'd been asked to do, we didn't have anything for, and Steven would have to make up something for it. But instead it was like, oh, cool, we've got this Greenlander song.
First thing in my notes here is that you on Rainstick, Bob?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. Again, to me, this is a continuation of the genius of the early band. I mean,
same recording session as Watery Domestic. But just, you know, Watery Domestic was intended to be an EP, so that song was just part of the cutting room floor from Watery Domestic. Leibold might have played on this as well.
You know, Steven's prowess at being able to write a ballad. A lot of people don't talk about that, but I've really always loved his ability to write a great ballad. Stop Breathing's another great one. One of the great unmentioned songs for me is Blackout from Wowie Zowie.
Great. Newark Wilder's great. I mean, he's just very gifted songwriter. He can do a lot of things. So that's very, and Don't You Cry is great.
This song I give a hard 5. It's
We Dance is great. Yeah, I mean, Greenlander, for what it is, I give it a 4. It was cool song.
Wow, hard rating. I give it a hard 5. This is a 5 stars with 7 boners coming out of it.
That's sickening.
It is disgusting. Another compilation track, and something where it begins a very playful relationship with REM, is Unseen Power of the Picket Fence. What I really love about this song is a few things. Number one, Time After Time is the worst song on the record, on Reckoning. All of my friends and myself, big REM fans. You know, it's funny, Murmur is definitely, even though Reckoning is a huge record for me as well, Murmur is definitely like that was the big kick in the ass for me from REM. Both of the REM songs that you guys have, this and the Camera cover, they start as straight tributes, and they take a hard left, both of them. This one takes a hard left into Sherman's March lyrical territory. And then the other one, I don't even know what the left turn is. It goes from a cover of Camera into talking about offices with double-digit floors. My guess at the time was it was, you know, a sort of depressed outlook on being in the music business.
I forgot the cover of Camera existed, and as you spoke of it, I recalled it.
It's beautiful.
I think it was just like a splendid little accident. Unseen Power of the Picket Fence was one of the first times in which you very much see the entrance of Steve West and his spirit into the band. He's, amongst many other things, part of him is that he's a historian of the war between the states, more formally known as the Civil War. And obviously Sherman's March, and his wife is named Andra Sherman. Everybody involved with it, with the exception of Leibold. I don't think Leibold, you know, we lived early Pavement, and the only people that would have been Leibold, who was just more punk during those years, and obviously Gary, who wouldn't have really even known what the hell this was about. But, you know, the other 4 people were massive REM fans, concurrent with their early releases. Some of the biggest thrills of our adolescence was going to see them live after the records that you mentioned. Very easy band for us to pay tribute to, because not only did they have a huge influence on us as teenagers, they also opened the door to just the incredible variety of bands that they would have support them, whether it be Dream Syndicate or Gang of Four or Wire or Minutemen. Just one of the top 20 influences on Pavement.
It comes through in the music. I mean, it certainly is more, I think.
More so them than The Fall. REM's a bigger influence on Pavement than The Fall earlier.
Well, I think as time goes on in the band, that REM influence comes to the fore a lot more, or it's allowed to come.
But you can hear the REM influence on Watery Domestic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
been a bit on Slanted.
Not as much for me.
There are a few songs that could have been on Fables of the Reconstruction or something.
Sure, Fables, yeah.
In fact, I'm sure that they would have loved to have written for Fables of the or Monster or something. At least Michael, he was a Pavement fan from the start.
And frankly, he'd be a friggin' idiot not to be. That's it for this episode. Plenty to come. Catch us next time, next week, when the tour continues and the show continues, and we find out exactly what the heck happened with 1994's brilliant Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain. We'll see you next time on Discography.